Hello viewers, welcome to week 8, lecture 1 of Swayam course on 20th century literary criticism and theory part 1. I am Ashish Kumar Pathak, assistant professor, Department of English, Banaras Hindu University, and in this lecture I am going to continue my discussion of three other American deconstructionists who are Harold Bloom, J. Hillis Miller, and Barbara Johnson. So far as Harold Bloom is concerned, his contribution to literary theory is significant, where we find that Bloom treats literature as a special field of study and combines the theories of tropes, Freudian psychology, and Kabbalistic mysticism to forge his theories. For example, when we talk about rhetorical post-structuralism, this discussion of tropes becomes very important, and especially in the field of historiography, we have seen that how Hayden White, in his work Tropics of Discourse, he has tried to deconstruct this objective notion of history, right? For example, uh, Hayden White argues that usually we believe that history is objective, and in history we try to give an objective account of what has happened in past or human societies. However, he agrees with the notion of Derrida or Paul de Man, as we have seen in the previous lectures, how they have talked about this rhetoric and philosophy. And they say that this rhetoricity of language is so pervasive, it is so deeply embedded with tropes that it does not allow any access to truth. And in this way, history cannot claim to objective knowledge or claim to imparting objective knowledge. He goes on to say that when we develop any discipline, we need data, and data is always processed through language. We always try to seek a language which is appropriate to the analysis of that data or processing of that data. But so when we look at language, as it applies to scientific data that a historian has maybe collected, but when it comes to the processing of that data, language and its role becomes dominant. For example, Kenneth Burke has talked about four, tropes of language: metaphor, metonymy, synecdoche, and irony. Right? How these four tropes, they distort the conveyance of truth in language. And in this way, so when we read Bloom also sets great store by the theory of tropes. And Bloom was a prolific author, as we know. He has written more than 40 critical books in his entire career. The most remarkable contribution of Harold Bloom to current or 20th century literary theory is his concept of the anxiety of influence. He argues that since Milton, and he calls Milton the first truly subjective poet, he says that after that, all writers, they have suffered, from an awareness of belatedness. Now, what is this belatedness? Belatedness is an idea in which a writer believes that he has come to history or he has reached a historical junction very late. In what sense he says that he has reached it late? Because when a writer appears on the scene, he finds that what are the resources available to him for writing? What are the motives? What are the themes? What are the ideas? And then this consciousness of writer that all these things, they have already been used by my predecessors, it leaves that writer in a state of dilemma. There he feels that, he feels a sort of anxiety about creating a space for himself. And to create that, space for himself, he has to, put up a fight with his predecessors. So he says that any writer who is writing at a moment, he has to indulge in a sort of psychic struggle with his predecessors to create a space for himself, right? And then he goes on to say that in what ways this space is created. Bloom says that these later poets, they experience an Oedipal hatred of the father, and in this way a desperate desire to deny paternity. And he says that the suppression of their aggressive feelings gives rise to various defensive strategies. And in this way, the psychic struggle, it involves misreading masters and combats stifling tradition. It results in anxiety of influence. So in this way, in terms of Freud, Harold Bloom is trying to establish the relationship of a contemporary writer or of a writer of current time, with the writer of the past in terms of Oedipal hatred. For example, an infant has a sort of love-hate relationship towards the father and mother. Similarly, a writer has that kind of relationship. And in this way, what is the strategy that a writer has to adopt to create a space for himself? So, he has to deliberately misread or misinterpret the predecessor. So, when one misinterprets the predecessors, one creates a space for himself. For example, we have seen this tendency in context of Eliot. The kind of relationship that Eliot has with Arnold, we can say that how it is a kind of Oedipal relationship. Not only with Arnold, this is just one example I am giving. If you look at Eliot, Eliot is having same Oedipality towards Wordsworth, towards Coleridge, or even towards Tennyson, right? So this Oedipality is always there. Tennyson is having the same kind of Oedipality towards the Romantic poets. Within Romantic tradition, this trait can also be seen. For instance, let us try to understand how this anxiety of influence. Look at T.S. Eliot. T.S. Eliot was very critical of Matthew Arnold, and at one place he says that where Matthew Arnold had to, focus on the literature, instead of focusing on the literature, he started cleaning the country, and in this way his focus was not there on literature. And Eliot makes all these comments on Arnold's writing in context of Arnold's interest in society, for example, culture and anarchy, or even when Arnold is talking about the function of criticism, how Arnold is concerned about the atmosphere. The best kind of minds can be produced in the best kind of climate. So, so in this way, Eliot is saying that this cultural dimension which Matthew Arnold brings in his literary criticism is something bad thing. But if we look at the writings of Eliot, we find that even he does the same thing. But to create a space for himself, he has to misrepresent Matthew Arnold. And later on in his life, at one time he acknowledged that in Arnold, he could see a distorted image of himself. So this is how we can understand this anxiety of influence. For example, Harold Bloom also through Kabbalistic writings, Kabbalistic writings, they refer to Jewish rabbinical texts which reveal hidden meanings in the Bible, and he says they are classical examples of revisionary texts. Revisionary text in the sense that the Bible is interpreted in a new light. So, Bloom believes that Isaac Luria's 16th century version of Kabbalistic mysticism is an exemplary model of the way poets revise earlier poets in post-Renaissance poetry. So, in this way, he develops from Luria the three stages of revision. So, when a writer looks at his predecessors, he has three stages of revisions. What are the three stages? The first stage is that of limitation, in which a writer looks at his previous writer and he deliberately points out that what are the limitations of those writers, because by determining their limitations, a contemporary writer or a current writer may create a space for himself. How go beyond those limitations? In this way, it is a kind of justification for his own writings. The second is substitution, in which there are certain problematic elements that the predecessor has established. So, all those things, how they need to be replaced, they need to be substituted, and in this way it again creates a space for the current writer. And third one is representation. Representation in the sense that there was something missing in the meaning of the predecessor. So, in this way this writer will be able to restore meaning to the predecessor. So, in this way these are three stages in which a writer engages himself in a psychic struggle or psychic fight with his predecessors, and in this way this anxiety of influence, it creates a space for the writer in which he is going to write something, right. So, he says that when a strong poet writes, he repeatedly passes through the three stages in a dialectical manner as he grapples with the strong poets of the past. In his book, A Map of Misreading, which Bloom wrote in 1975, he demonstrates that how meaning is produced in post-enlightenment images by the language strong poets use in defense against and response to language of the prior strong poets. In this context, that famous debate of the Romantics and Neoclassicals regarding the diction, and that is a perfect example to understand this thing, that when Wordsworth and others, how they started writing, when the Romantics started writing, they reacted against the notion of diction which was established by the neoclassical writers. So, they say that how those neoclassical writers, they believed in two notions of language, language of poetry and ordinary language. And in this way, specific words and their appropriateness for writing poetry, this tendency resulted in the rise of diction, and these Romantics contend that this tendency, because of this tendency, the language of poetry was dissociated from the language of common man. And therefore, we find that how Wordsworth, in his preface to the Lyrical Ballads, he says that he is going to write for the common people, for the rustic people in their own language. So, this love for the language of common man or ordinary speech, that has to be the language of poetry. That is what these Romantics are contending. However, later on we believe that Wordsworth himself ended up in developing a new theory of diction. But however, this is also an instance by which we can understand this concept of anxiety of influence, or how a tradition of writers, a current group of writers, they involve themselves in misreading of the predecessors. So, in this way, strong poets cope with the anxiety of influence by adopting separately or successively 6 psychic defenses. Now, what are these 6 psychic defenses? Let us look at them. So, these appear in their poetry as tropes which allow a poet to swerve from a father's poems. So, the 6 tropes are irony, synecdoche, metonymy, hyperbole or litotes, metaphor and metalepsis. So, if we look at these tropes, how we are reminded of Kenneth Burke's notion of tropes in context of history writing, or tropes pervasive in the text of history that we discussed in the beginning of this lecture. Bloom in this way uses 6 classical words to describe 6 kinds of relationship between the texts of fathers and sons, and he says that this revisionary ratio, that is something significant. So, 6 classical words: Klinemen, tessera, kenosis, demonization, ascesis and apophredis. The tropes and defenses are interchangeable forms of revisionary ratios. For example, Klinemen is the swerve a poet makes in order to justify a new poetic direction. So, this involves a deliberate misinterpretation of an earlier poet. Further, tessera is a fragment. So, there we find that how a poet treats the materials of a precursor poem as if they were in pieces and required the finishing touch of the successor. So, if we look at these terms, we find that how every writing of the past is not understood by a current poet as something that is complete in itself, that is full in itself. There are always lacunas, there are always gaps, and this writer is always trying to fulfill those gaps, and in this way there is a justification for his existence. And however, if you look at the history, literary history, such tradition or such tendency continues, and therefore literature at any given time or any poem is never a complete entity. It is always incomplete from the successor's point of view as well. So, Klinemen is a revisionary ratio, and it has the rhetorical form of irony, the figure of speech, not of thought, and is the psychic defense called reaction formation. The other ratios are simply expressed as both trope and psychic defense, like tessera is like synecdoche, turning against the self, and so on. So, in this way, we find that how Bloom pays particular attention to the romantic crisis poems of Wordsworth, Shelley, Keats and Tennyson, and he shows that how each poet struggles to mistreat or misread his predecessors creatively. For example, Shelley's Ode to the West Wind, it struggles with Wordsworth's Immortality Ode as follows: stanza 1 and 2, Klinemen or tessera; 4, kenosis; demonization; 5th, ascesis and Aphrodis. So, in this way, we can read the 2 poems, or we can understand the 2 poets in relation to this anxiety of influence. Let us move now to another important deconstructionist, American deconstructionist, J. Hillis Miller. Miller was a member of that Yale School of Criticism, and he was very much influenced by the Geneva School of Phenomenology. His works mostly focus on the deconstruction of fiction. For example, his prominent works are The Form of Victorian Fiction, Fiction and Repetition, 7 English novels; The Linguistic Moment, from Wordsworth to Stevens; The Ethics of Reading; Theory Now and Done. For example, if we look at a paper that Miller wrote at an early age on Dickens, how he takes up the theory, Jacobson's theory of metaphor and metonymy, and we will see that how Miller ends up by blurring this distinction between metaphor and metonymy. So, he demonstrates how the realism of sketches by Bose is not a mimetic effect, but a figurative one. For example, Bose is represented at Monmouth Street, and there he looks at human artifacts, things, clothes, streets, buildings, vehicles, etc. at other places, and in this way he says that how Bose metonymically makes sense of these things, right? So, how these things which are absent, they are brought to his mind, and these things are, I mean, this process is metonymic in nature. So, in this way, how Bose infers that what kind of life was being lived by these people, and by this metonymic association, when Bose notices all those things. However, Miller's account does not stop here with a realistic understanding of this thing. He shows that how metonymic dead men's clothes, they come to life in Bose's mind as he imagines their absent wearers. For example, waistcoats have almost burst with anxiety to put themselves on. And in this way, Miller identifies this reciprocity of this metonymic process existing between a person and his surrounding. For example, houses, possessions, so on, and which he then considers as the basis for the metaphorical substitutions so frequent in Dickens fiction. So, in the first case we find, in the first example that we find, that how metonymy asserts relationship with the help of context or association, while metaphor shows relationship with similarity. So, in the previous case, in metonymic case, this association or context is there, in which clothes, objects and persons, they are related to each other. But with the passage of time, this context disappears, and how clothes are replaced by people. So, in a way, Hillis Miller is trying to prove that metaphor is all, right. So, there is no effect called metonymic effect. For example, Miller perceives a further self-conscious fictionality in Dickens' fondness for theatrical metaphor. For example, one character goes through an admirable bit of serious pantomime, speaks in a stage of whisper, and appears later like ghost of Queen Anne in the tent scene in Richard. So here we find that Miller finds that there is an endless deferment of presence in Dickens' fiction. Everyone imitates or repeats someone else's behavior, real or fictional. So, the metonymic process encourages a literal reading, while at the same time it acknowledges its own figurality, and in this way Miller deconstructs that Jacobson's original opposition between realistic or metonymy or poetic and metaphor. He says that a correct interpretation of them sees the figurative as figurative. Both invite misinterpretation, which takes as substantial what are in fact only linguistic fictions. It is often argued that Miller sometimes falls in the vice of incomplete reversal of metaphysical hierarchy, literal and figurative. For example, Jared Graff has pointed out this point in his work Literature Against Itself, that if you look at Hillis Miller's deconstruction, there we find that if Miller is trying to establish the hierarchy of figurative reading over literal reading, so in this way Miller is going against the ethos of deconstruction, because in deconstruction, if you privilege one over the other, again you are trying to re-establish a new hierarchy, and this goes against the spirit of deconstruction. In deconstruction, there is no hierarchy, only free play. So, figurative and literal, they are centering and decentering, and this centering and decentering is endless. So that is how we understand Miller. Barbara Johnson is another important critic or deconstructionist. And Johnson's critical scholarship incorporated a variety of structuralism and post-structuralist perspectives, including deconstruction, Lacanian psychoanalysis, and feminist theory. As a professor and translator at Harvard University, Johnson helped make the theories of Derrida accessible to English-speaking audiences in the United States at a time when they had just begun to gain recognition in France. Accordingly, she is often associated with the Yale School of Academic Literary Criticism, and her seminal works are The Critical Difference, A World of Difference, The Wake of Deconstruction, The Feminist Difference, Mother Tongues, etc. Johnson's critical, difference is an essay which contains subtle and lucid deconstructive reading of literature and criticism. She shows that both literary and critical texts, they set up a network of differences in which they try to lure the reader with a promise of comprehension. For example, she refers to Barthes's, stories, Barthes's analysis of Balzac's Saracen in S/Z, how Barthes dismantles this masculine-feminine difference. So, by cutting up the novella into lexias, Barthes appears to resist any total reading of the text meaning in terms of sexuality. Johnson shows that Barthes' reading nevertheless privileged castration, and further that his distinction between the readerly and the writerly text corresponds to Balzac's distinction between the ideal woman, that is Zambinella as conceived by Saracen, and castrato Zambinella in actuality. So, in this way, Zambinella resembles both the perfect unity of readerly text and the fragmented and undecidable writerly text. And Barthes' method of reading evidently favors castration, whereas Saracen's image of Zambinella is based upon narcissism. Her perfection is the symmetrical counterpart of Saracen's masculine self-image. So, in this way, Johnson's essential point about Barthes' reading of Balzac is that Barthes actually spells out the fact of castration where Balzac leaves it unspoken. In this way, Barthes reduces a difference to an identity, and Jakobson makes this point not as criticism of Barthes, but as an illustration of the inevitable blindness of critical insight. So, before I come to the end of this understanding deconstruction, or we exhaust this movement, let us have a comparative estimate all these movements. If we look at all these movements, we find that the position of Russian formalists is very balanced, and how these Russian formalists, they addresses the excesses of post-structuralist or reader response critics or structuralists in their criticism. For example, the kind of liberty that reader response criticism is given to the reader at the cost of the author. Russian formalists, they always take a sensible stand in that way, in which, Tomasvsky's implied reader is someone who is very crucial in, asserting the features of the text or a poem or a novel, but at the same time, that reader is not creator. That reader is not going to replace the author completely. So, this balance between the text and the reader and the author that we find in those Russian formalists, that is missing from these movements. On the other hand, like post-structuralism, we find that the culmination of post-structuralism is that there is no genre distinction. They blurred the distinction between literature and philosophy or other disciplines. However, Russian formalists, they are very conscious about genre distinction, because they know that defamiliarization in poetry is caused by a different technical device, and defamiliarization in prose fiction is done by a different technical device. So in this way, we find that how these Russian formalists are very sensible. Even in context of structuralism, where structuralism is quite indifferent to meaning and only interested in the structure which causes meaning, there we find that how Russian formalists, they say that in prose fiction meaning is very essential, and in poetry you can ignore it. So in this way, we have a comparative estimate of those movements as well. Thank you for watching this.